Hello and welcome to part 5 of our Foxic CAD-A-Long. So most of what this video is stuff we've already covered, just moving along in the build, but a few more things that we pick up on are going to be tangent dimensions, dark and light themes, and isolating components. So I made a bit of an oopsie whoopsie when I first started recording this. I've been recording with this light theme normally, but when I normally CAD off camera I use a dark theme, and I forgot to change it back. But I figured, since I made this mistake, we can at least learn something out of it. So let's talk about Fusion's UI themes. So I picked Kelpie here because it has a lot of black. So if you take a look at the edges and lines here, it's kind of hard to see. This black kind of fades into this black, which fades into this black, and it doesn't have the best contrast. So if you go down here to display settings and then hover over environment, you can change your theme. So dark sky is the UI theme I usually work with, and you can see the white edges really make these parts pop a little bit more, and it's really easy to tell where all the edges are. So this is where I normally work. It's not that big of a deal with a green robot, but when there's a lot of black in your robot, I find this dark theme to be better. But it's all personal preference, of course. If you don't like it, you can go back down to display settings, and then environment and photo booth is the default, but there are a few other options here. So let's change that back to photo booth. So like I said earlier, the first part of the video will be in that darker theme, so if it looks weird, I'm sorry. But I do realize partway through and change it back. So anyway, back to the tutorial. Alright, so in the last part we made this servo here in servo horn, so now we can add this to our project. I'm going to make the electronics folder our active component folder and just drag this guy in. And now we have a servo. So we'll hit OK here. So now let's add a mount for our servo so that we can bolt it to our chassis. So I'm going to select the chassis as our active component, create a new sketch on the base here, and I'm just going to make two rectangles, and these are going to be little standoffs that we'll put holes in and then bolt the holes on the servo here too. So we're going to need some dimensions here. The width of this thing is going to be the same as this width, so let's get a measurement here with the I key. We get 0.2585, so I'm going to click here to copy it to my clipboard, and then I'll add a dimension with the D tool, click on this line and paste that in. And then this length is going to be kind of whatever we want, however thick we think it needs to be. So let's try 1/2 inch, you can always change it later. And then with the equals tool, I'm going to make these the same, like so. And let's also make two of these lines collinear so that they line up. So the way we're going to position this is relative to these two walls. So let's take the distance between this wall and say, whatever we want, 1/4 inch, 1/8 inch. And then maybe 0.75 inches there. So now all we need is just how big the gap is here, and we can find that out by measuring the width of our servo. So another eye measurement from this side to this side, and I'm just holding down Control to select those, and we get this value here. So clicking again to copy, then let's click here, Control click here, press D, add that value, plus a slip fit so that we can easily get the servo in and out. So that's fully defined now. We're going to select these two and extrude them, but we need to know by how much. So that's basically going to be the height of the servo here. So push an I, select the bottom, Control click on the top, and we get 0.771. So I'm just going to grab this value. Then I'll select these two, hit E for extrude, and Control V to paste that in, and then I'm just hitting escape to get rid of the menu there so it doesn't try to autofill anything, and then press enter, and there are our standoffs. So let's make this parent the active component so we can see everything. I'm just going to move this receiver out of the way. By moving this, it's going to ask me if I want to lock that move command. So when I push J here, we'll say capture position. Alright, so let's grab the middle of this edge and put it on the middle of this edge since they're the same height, and then rotate that guy so it lines up. And then you can see there's a gap here, so to center this, let's move it by slip fit divided by 2, and that'll center it. Negative slip fit divided by 2. There we go. Just to make sure that it's centered with an equal gap on each side. And there it is. So now we can add holes here for our bolts, but first I kind of want to mess with the positioning here. We might end up routing the wires behind the servo, so I want enough space for that, but that's too much space for that, so I'm gonna double click on our sketch here and move it to like 0.65. See how that looks? And that's pretty good. We'll keep that the way it is. So now let's add those holes. So once again, our chassis as the main component, and let's make a sketch on this face of the green block. Be careful not to click on the servo itself. And I'm going to push P for project, and then I'll just click on these holes in the servo here. Hit OK, and now I'll select them by clicking and holding down Control, and then I'll push E for extrude. We're going to change distance here to 2 object and click on the back so that it will extrude to whatever size we end up making these little mounts. So hit OK, and now we have some through holes for our bolts. We might need to enlarge these holes, but we won't really know until we print it. Kind of depends on how much wiggle room the servo holes had. So now our servo is mounted, and if we click and drag on this, we can kind of play with the servo here. And that's pretty fun. And then hit Control Z to put it back to where it originated from. Alright, so let's get started on that lifting arm. So I'm going to make a new component and call it weapon, and that's just going to have all the pieces of the weapon arm in it. And inside of our weapon component, let's add a new component and call it arm. And with arm selected, we'll make a new sketch on the standoff here. So we're going to reuse the same hole for the axle. So I'm going to hit P for project and grab that circle. So that's in our sketch. So we're just going to take the line tool here and kind of sketch out what the flipper arm will look like. If you look at a picture of Foxic, you see it kind of has that fur pattern going on at the top. So we're going to do our best to replicate that. So let's start with some lines. These will go out to who knows where, slope down, back up, and then up here we'll start the fur pattern. So let's start adding some constraints to this. Make some horizontal and vertical lines. We're just getting that error because this was already vertical. We'll have another line here. So let's add a dimension to how thick we want the arm to be. Actually, before we do that, we need to make sure they are parallel. Then we'll add a dimension, and we'll say 3/8 of an inch. And we'll make this also that same 3/8. So I'm going to make these lines equal. Looking good. Now let's kind of lock down where we want this to be relative to the hinge. So I think it could stick out about here. So let's do a 1/4 of an inch. And I don't really think this needs to be centered. I think it's fine if it's up higher like that. So let's say from the center point to the bottom here is 1/8 of an inch. Sorry, I'm typing with a band-aid on my finger. Makes typing difficult. And we can just kind of guess at what angle we want here. I don't like how. There we go. So let's do 35 degrees for this slope here. And then we'll kind of make the fox head shallower. And let's measure how long we want this thing to be. So let's start off with 1.75 inches. Whoa. And we'll make the 3 other fur patterns that same height. But let's continue locking this down. So you can see we can still move this around. I basically want this to be away from the wheel and then kind of lined up with the base plate. So let's use the project tool and project the base at the bottom here. And then we'll say this line and this point are a coincidence of each other. So that'll lock down the vertical part. Now it just moves horizontally. And then we can just say how far away from the wheel we want this to be. So you may be tempted to define the position horizontally by selecting the circle and the line and then adding a dimension, but the problem with that is that the circle dimension is being defined by the center point. So if we were to define this and then make the circle bigger, it wouldn't scoot the arm over more like we need it to. So the way this should work is you should make the dimension, and before you select the circle, right click, and they have this pick circle tangent option instead of pick circle center, which it's buggy or it doesn't work, because if you click on it, this looks like it's exactly what we need, but then when we finalize it, it shoots over here and defines itself on the right side instead of the left side, and now everything's broken. So we're gonna have to do this the lame way. Delete that and add a line from the center to here and make this a horizontal line. And then from this point to the arm, we can add our dimension. So keep that in mind just in case they fix this in the future, of being able to start with a dimension and then right clicking and then changing pick tangent. I'm sure they'll get it working eventually. So anyway, we will continue on. So everything is defined so far. Let's keep adding our little spiky things. So I'm going to keep making more lines like this until we have something kind of like that, that kind of looks like the spine fur on the back. So I'm going to make sure all of these are perpendicular. This one needs to be perpendicular, so I'm going to select those and do perpendicular. I'd also like these lines to be equal. And these little box things, we'll make them the same thickness here, so we'll make those equal. That actually might be too small, so I'm not going to make that one equal. I'll make this one, though, equal. Make this one like a 1/4 inch, give it its own definition. Otherwise, the amount of material here is too little. So that's looking good so far. Let's define the angle. Looks like 110 will work pretty well. And this one we want to make a little more shallow so that they kind of cascade. So let's just do 100 for this one. That's going to be too big also, so let's actually just get rid of this. Maybe a 1/4 inch for both. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So now our arm is fully defined. We can select all of these objects. This should actually be a construction line. I'm going to use X to change that. Select all these guys and extrude it, and we'll do -0.75 for the arm thickness. That looks pretty good. And now we have a cool little arm. Let's add a physical material. We'll add our ABS plastic and add the appearance of this green that we made. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea to just change the appearance of this, but we've already come this far. That's looking pretty good. Let's add the fur pattern on each of these little panels. So now let's make sure the arm is the active component, and we'll create a sketch on this first little cascading section. So to get that kind of fur pattern, we're going to make some lines, And we'll do something kind of like this. Since this little bit is shorter than the middle one, let's offset it by like a 1/16 of an inch. And we'll do the same thing on this side, but instead of typing it again, I'm just going to click on this dimension. Then let's make the middle triangle 60 degrees and one of these edge triangles 50 degrees. Then all we have to do is make the outer ones equal as well as the inner ones equal. And then make this point a center point on this line. And now we have a fully defined sketch. So that lets us select these two little guys, hit an E for extrude, and then change distance to 2 object, and we'll select this next rectangle as our target, and that'll make a cut like so. And now we have one of our little fur pattern things done. And unfortunately I don't have a cool trick to duplicate this pattern. If anyone knows of one, go ahead and leave a comment, but for now I'm just gonna do it all over again. Cool, and with that we have one Foxic arm. Make this the component to admire our work. So we need to cut a hole here, and then we're also going to have to center this and cut out a little channel so that our arm fits. So let's take care of those. Let's do this one first actually, because that's more dependent. So I'm going to right click the arm and select isolate, and that just isolates it so that we can take a clear look without having to worry about anything else getting in the way. And I'm going to go make a new sketch on the top here. And we'll do something like this. Creating a dimension on each side. Let's do 1/8 of an inch. And then we'll line up with the first little spiny bit there. And then we can just cut this chunk out, changing distance to 2 object. There we go. And if we unisolate our arm, you can see where that'll just slide in. So let's make a joint. For our first point, we'll select one of the circles on the inside of the arm. Then we'll select the standoff circle on here, and that'll snap into its place. And change motion to revolute. And there goes our arm. So we're gonna have to carve out a little bit more so that it doesn't rub against the standoff too much. So let's change this to 1/8 of an inch minus slip fit divided by 2. That makes it a tiny bit bigger. So that will give us the space, but we need to adjust that gap. So let's go back into the joint and slide it over by slip fit divided by 2. And now we're nice and centered. We have a gap. And we can drag our arm up and down. So it looks like we're good. I'm going to hit Control Z a few times so that that goes back to where it started. So now let's clear out a hole for the arm here. So let's go make our chassis the active component. Make a new sketch on the front. And let's project the full body of the arm just by clicking on that. And let's make a hole with a rectangle. Make sure we're on top of this line here to about there. And let's say maybe a 1/16 of an inch of space. Yeah, that's pretty good. Same thing on this side. I'll just click on that dimension and we'll make it 1/2 an inch deep. Does that give us enough clearance? Nope, gotta keep going. There we go. So 0.75. Finish the sketch. Turn that on so we can see it and hide the arm. So now we can select this, hit extrude, change distance to 2 object, and click on the back here. And that'll carve out a cool little chunk for our arm. So let's admire our work here. And it's starting to come together, starting to look like a fighting robot. And just to pretty things up, let's add some fillets to these back edges. These two. So maybe 1/4 of an inch there. And like an 1/8 inch here. There we go. Rounded edges always look nice. And then for a little bit of additional strength, let's fillet these inside edges 1/16 of an inch there. Cool. And with that, part 5 of our Foxic CAD-A-Long is complete. So be sure to leave a comment if you have any questions or other thoughts about the video, and make sure you're subscribed so that you are alerted when future videos come out. See you next time.